My son-in-law had a habit of pausing after he said something he believed was clever, just long enough to let the words settle. He was doing it in front of 60 people when the screen behind him changed. That's where I want to start. Not at the beginning, but at that moment. The moment Miriam from HR turned her laptop toward the projector feed, and Section 11.4 of the asset purchase agreement filled the wall behind my son-in-law's head. The room went still in a way that conference rooms almost never go still. Not polite quiet. Something deeper than that. He hadn't read it. 2 years of cashing checks from a company I built, and he had never once read the fine print. My name is Gene Whitaker. I'm 57 years old. I spent 24 years building Whitaker Regional Freight out of a leased lot on the east side of Fort Wayne, Indiana. 2 trucks. A fuel card I wasn't sure I could pay off. A used dispatch radio that crackled every time a semi passed on Route 24. I drove some of those routes myself in the first 3 years. Not because I had to, but because I needed to know every mile of what I was asking my drivers to do. My wife Agnes ran the books in those early years. She had a head for numbers and a patience for paperwork that I never quite matched. Insurance renewals, DOT compliance filings, invoicing, all of it, while I kept the trucks moving. We ate a lot of dinners standing at the kitchen counter because neither of us had time to sit down. When Agnes got sick, the company had 78 employees. She passed 3 years after the diagnosis. My daughter Rachel was 16. I spent the years that followed running a freight company and grieving at the same time, and I was not always as present as I should have been. That is something I carry. But I kept building, not out of ambition anymore. Out of obligation to Agnes, who had put her own fingerprints on every balance sheet, and to the people on my payroll who had mortgages and kids in Little League, and a reason to show up on Monday. By the time Rachel finished her master's degree, Whitaker Regional Freight had 140 employees, 52 trucks, and contracts with 3 of the largest distribution hubs in the Midwest. I had built something real, out of real work, in a real town. Not a concept, not a pitch deck, a thing you could stand next to and touch. At 54, I sold 65% of the company to Meridian Capital Partners out of Atlanta. They rebranded it as Meridian Freight Solutions Midwest Division. New logo, new signage, same trucks. I kept 35% and a seat on the advisory board. My attorney Paul Drexler had spent 3 weeks on the asset purchase agreement. He flagged 2 clauses as unusual. I told him both were non-negotiable. Meridian signed. I don't think the men in that Atlanta conference room read it as carefully as they should have. In my experience, people who have never driven a truck tend to underestimate the people who have. Rachel met my son-in-law at a conference in Nashville. She called me the same night, voice up half an octave the way it gets when she's trying not to sound too excited. Fletcher had an MBA from Vanderbilt. He worked in supply chain consulting. He had strong opinions about operational inefficiency, she said, and she meant it as a compliment. I met him 2 months later at a steakhouse near her apartment in Indianapolis. Firm handshake, a way of redirecting conversations back to himself so smoothly you almost didn't notice. He asked me one question about the freight business, listened for 40 seconds, then spent the next 20 minutes explaining how the logistics industry was being disrupted by automation. I nodded. I knew more about logistics automation than he'd covered in 3 semesters of graduate school, but I let it go. Rachel looked at him across the table, like he was the answer to something she'd been trying to solve. That was enough for me. They married when she was 32. I walked her down the aisle. His handshake at the altar was firm. His eyes moved once toward the guest list as we shook. The first year he was polite. The second year he started correcting me. Quietly at first. A redirect at dinner when I mentioned anything about freight. Actually, the models shifted pretty significantly in the last 5 years. Or the slow nod, the particular nod that professors give when a student has almost understood something. When I described how I'd structured the company's insurance portfolio, Rachel would catch my eye across the table. I'd let it go. Here is the part that matters. 18 months after the acquisition, Meridian brought Fletcher in as Director of Operations for their Midwest division. My company, under a different name. His onboarding documents referred to the original owner as prior principal. Standard acquisition language, a clean break on paper. Nobody told him who the prior principal was. And Rachel had asked me, very directly, not to complicate things. So I didn't say a word. Labor Day weekend, 2 years into his tenure, we were at their house outside Indianapolis. A nice place, with the kitchen island that found its way into every conversation about the kitchen. Fletcher was talking about the company over dinner. Q4 projections, a restructuring initiative he called the Network Optimization Plan. At some point he mentioned the drivers. Long haul's the biggest drag on the cost structure, he said. He picked up his fork. We're looking at repositioning a significant portion of the driver pool. I set down my glass. How many drivers? He glanced at Rachel, then back at me. It's still in development. How many? He leaned back, did the pause. Look, and I say this with respect, this is a different era of logistics. What worked in 1999 doesn't work now. The metrics are different. The margins are different. He looked at me the way people look at an antique they've already decided not to buy. Honestly, with all due respect, the way you ran that company, I wouldn't have structured it that way. The cost basis alone. How many drivers? The table was quiet. Rachel looked at her plate. He smiled, patient. It's not something we need to get into right now. I finished my dinner. I helped clear the plates. I hugged Rachel at the door and shook Fletcher's hand. I drove home on I-69 in the dark, 54 miles, and I did not turn on the radio. That night Rachel called. He didn't mean it as an attack, Dad. Please don't make this a thing. Okay, I said. I didn't make it a thing, not yet. 6 weeks later, my phone rang on a Tuesday morning. It was Otto. Otto had run my dispatch floor since 2005. He knew every driver's wife's name, every truck's quirk, every corridor runtime in the Midwest network. He had been with me since the company had 12 trucks. Gene, his voice was lower than usual. You hear about the NOP? I've heard the outline. It's 44 drivers, long haul, all of them. Gordy Haas, the Delgado brothers, Phil Connors, who's been running the Detroit-Chicago corridor since before they resurfaced 94. He stopped. These are people, Gene. I knew every name he said. Gordy had started with me at 23. Phil had worked for me so long I had spoken at his son's high school graduation. The board approved the framework, Otto said. It just needs one final sign-off to go to implementation. Is there anything you can do? I already knew what that meant. Paul Drexler had written a clause into the asset purchase agreement. Any workforce restructuring affecting more than 20 positions required prior written approval from the retained interest holder. That was me. It had always been me. Meridian Capital had bought 65% of the company and inherited every clause in that agreement, and in 2 years, not one of them, including my son-in-law, had looked at it closely enough to understand what they'd signed. I'm coming, I said. 3 days later, Fletcher called with an invitation. We're doing an all-hands at the Fort Wayne facility next Friday. Thought it might be good for you to come. See how the operation runs now. He had a particular way of pausing after sentences like that. I said yes. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes. Then I called Paul Drexler. Pull out the Meridian Asset Purchase Agreement, sections 11.4 and 8.2. Confirm they're still in effect. Paul called back in an hour. Nobody's touched them. Everything intact. You want me to do anything with it? Not yet. Then I sent an email to Miriam Park, HR Compliance Director at Meridian Freight Solutions, Midwest Division. I had met her twice, once at the acquisition close and once at a benefits audit. She was precise and thorough, and had the kind of attention to detail that made you understand why certain people end up in compliance. The email said, Miriam, I'll be attending the all-hands at Fort Wayne on Friday as an advisory board guest. Per sections 11.4 and 8.2 of the Asset Purchase Agreement, please have the retained interest documentation available if needed. Her reply came 3 hours later. Mr. Whitaker, of course. I'll have everything ready. No alarm, no questions, just of course. That's when I understood something. Miriam had known who I was from day one. Compliance reported to the board, not to my son-in-law. She had been sitting on that information for 2 years, doing her job correctly, waiting for someone with standing to invoke it. Thursday evening, Otto called again. The vote's scheduled for next week, he said. Once the ANOP gets the final sign-off, termination notices go out within 30 days. I told him I'd see him Friday. That night I sat at the table where Agnes and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 19 years. The same table with the burn mark on the corner from a hot pan in 2003. I thought about Phil Connors on that Detroit-Chicago run. I thought about the Delgado brothers, who had come up as dock loaders and put themselves through CDL training on nights and weekends. I want to be honest with you. If Fletcher had only said what he said to me at that dinner table, I would have let it go forever. But 44 families is a different kind of math. Friday morning, I was up at 5:30, khaki pants and the dark blue Henley I'd been wearing to the floor since the early 2000s. I drove 54 miles up I-69 to Fort Wayne, the same route 1,000 times. The facility sat at the end of Coliseum Boulevard with a Meridian Freight Solutions sign out front. Brushed steel lettering, corporate font. Nice sign. I had chosen that lot in 1998 for the highway access and the drainage. The sign was different. The drainage was mine. I pulled in 20 minutes early and sat in my truck. Otto crossed the parking lot and changed direction when he spotted me. He knocked on my window. I rolled it down. His eyes were red at the rims. "Didn't think you'd actually come," he said. I told him I said I would. We walked in together. Fletcher was near the entrance talking to two operations managers. When he saw me, something moved across his face, a quick recalculation. "You made it." He gestured toward the back of the room. "Grab a seat wherever. Get a sense of where we're headed." "Sure," I said. Walking through that building, I passed the dispatch floor, where I'd let go of my first bad hire, and hired the best operations manager I ever had the following week. The layout was the same. The dock extension on the east side. I had approved those blueprints on a Saturday morning at the same desk. The carpet was new. Every hallway was mine. The conference room held about 65 people. Standing room along the back wall. Otto and I took chairs near the end of the last row. The room smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent lights and something underneath that I recognized as diesel drifting up from the dock. Fletcher stood at the front with a slide deck on the screen. He had the posture of someone who had practiced this. Shoulders back, pauses timed, the controlled competence that looks like authority if you don't know what actual authority looks like. He walked the room through Q4 numbers. Solid margins. 2 new distribution contracts. The room was polite and attentive. Then a new slide, network optimization plan, white background, blue headers, 44 positions, long-haul fleet, effective April 1. The room changed. I could feel it before I could see it. A shift in the quality of the silence. Someone in the third row leaned toward the person next to them. Gail, who had been my office manager for 11 years and was now the facility's administrative lead, looked at her hands. Fletcher kept talking, cost reduction, modernization, long-term competitiveness. The words came out practiced, and I had no doubt he believed every one of them. Then he looked up from the slide, found me at the back, a small smile. "Actually, since we have a guest with us today," he gestured toward me, easy, almost generous. "Why don't you come up and share a perspective? Give us the view from someone who built something in this space." He meant it as a prop, a contrast, a before photo standing next to the after. I stood up. I walked to the front. He handed me the microphone. He thought he was in control of the room. I held it, took a breath. From where I was standing, I could see all 65 faces. Otto in the back, Gail on the left, Phil Connors 3 rows in, hands folded. I looked at Fletcher. "Before I do that, can you tell the room who holds final approval authority on any workforce restructuring plan under the asset purchase agreement?" A beat. He tilted his head. "That would be the Meridian Capital Board, obviously." "Miriam." I turned toward HR Compliance Director Miriam Park, who was seated along the side wall with a laptop open in front of her. "Would you pull up section 11.4 of the Asset Purchase Agreement and put it on the screen?" Fletcher straightened. "What? Why would you?" "You invited me up here for transparency," I said. "Let's be transparent." Miriam's fingers moved on her keyboard without hesitation. The slide deck behind Fletcher went dark. A PDF replaced it, white pages, black text. The kind of formatting that belongs to attorneys. The room went completely still. Fletcher turned to look at the screen, then at Miriam, then at me. Miriam scrolled to section 11.4. It filled the wall behind his head. Section 11.4. All workforce restructuring plans affecting more than 20 positions require prior written approval from the retained interest holder, Eugene R. Whitaker, whose 35% retained interest includes veto authority over fleet staffing and long-haul driver classification decisions. She scrolled slightly. Section 8.2. Payroll disbursement authority for positions below regional director level remains with the retained interest holder until a full buyout is executed per the terms of Schedule C. The room read it. I could tell by the way eyes moved, left to right, then back again, the way people read something they need to be certain about. Then, from somewhere near the back wall, in a voice that wasn't loud but carried, Otto said, "That's the man who built every inch of this place." And the room understood. A few seconds of silence. Then one person near the middle began to clap. A few more joined. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was the sound of people who had been holding something in and finally had somewhere to put it. Fletcher stood at the front of the room, with section 11.4 projected behind his head. His face had lost its color. I let the applause finish. "To answer your original question," I said, "I don't see the value in eliminating 44 long-haul positions that can be managed through a phased consolidation plan. I'd like to present that plan to the room now, if there are no objections." There were none. The meeting ran another 45 minutes. I laid out the framework, an 18-month route consolidation and voluntary attrition plan that addressed the cost structure without a single termination notice. I had drafted it in the 3 weeks after Otto first called me. My advisory board access included fleet performance data. I had known something was coming before Labor Day. I hadn't known exactly when I would use the plan. I had known I would. People asked real questions. I answered them. Fletcher stood to the side for most of it with his arms crossed, saying nothing. Afterward, as people filed out, he found me near the conference room door. He took my arm, not rough, but definite, and pulled me 2 steps from the foot traffic. "What the hell was that?" His voice was low and controlled. "You ambushed me in front of my entire team." "You invited me," I said. "This is going to blow back on Rachel. Rachel can call me, I'll be home by 4. You can't just walk into my operation and—" "I've been in this operation every month for 2 years," I said. I kept my voice the same temperature it had been since I walked in. "Signing your payroll. You just never read who was on the signature line." He had nothing for that. A few of his managers passed us in the hallway. They looked at the floor. I went back into the conference room, shook Otto's hand, then Phil Connors's, then Gail's. She held on a half-second longer than necessary and didn't say anything, and I didn't need her to. I walked out through the main entrance into the March air and got in my truck, sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel. Then I drove home. Rachel called at 6:47 that evening. I was eating leftover chili at the kitchen table. "Dad." Her voice was tight in the way it gets when she's been crying and decided to stop. "Fletcher is. He's really shaken. He worked months on that presentation." I set down my spoon. "Rachel, 44 families in Fort Wayne are keeping their jobs this week." A long silence. "Why didn't you just tell us?" Her voice was thin. "Why did you let him treat you that way for 2 years and then do that?" "I didn't tell him because you asked me not to complicate things. I honored that." "That's not," she stopped. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," I said, "but it's what happened." Another silence. I could hear her breathing. "He never asked," I said, "not once, about what I built, about what it cost to build it, about your mother. Not once in 3 years." The line was quiet for a long time. Then Rachel said very softly, "I know." I waited. "I'll call you later this week," she said. I need a couple days." "Okay," I said, "I love you. I'm here when you're ready." I hung up. I sat at Agnes's table until the chili went cold. I didn't doubt what I'd done, but being right and being at peace are 2 different things, and sometimes the road between them is longer than you expect. Monday morning, Stephen Cho, managing partner at Meridian Capital, called me. His voice had the careful quality that comes from having an attorney nearby. "Mr. Whitaker, we spent the weekend reviewing the asset purchase agreement. We were not fully aware of the scope of your retained authority." "I understand," I said. "We'd like to invite you to a formal board session, in your capacity as retained interest holder, not as an advisory guest." A pause. "We should have done this from the beginning." "Yes," I said, "you should have." The board meeting was the following Thursday. I wore khaki pants and a clean flannel shirt because I didn't own a suit that still fit, and I wasn't going to buy one for the occasion. Fletcher was in the room. He presented the ANOP again, to a board that had now read the fine print. They didn't reject it outright. They're not sentimental people, and the company does need to modernize. But they required him to incorporate the phase consolidation framework as the primary restructuring approach, pending my written approval. At the end of the meeting, Fletcher shook my hand, Firm grip, eyes moving. Good plan, he said. I nodded. He walked out. 6 weeks later, Rachel came to my door on a Wednesday evening. No call ahead. She stood on the porch in her coat, hands in her pockets. I let her in. We sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, I've been thinking about what you said, that he never asked. I poured her a cup and sat across from her. He doesn't know who you are, she said. Not really. He knows you ran a freight company, that you sold it. He's never asked what it cost you to build it. He's never asked about Mom. She paused. I stopped asking too, about what you were going through after she died. That's not your fault, I said. Part of it is. She looked at her coffee. I wanted everything to be easy. I kept asking you to be smaller so he wouldn't feel threatened. I didn't confirm or deny it, she already knew. I put my hand on hers. We sat like that for a while, just the hum of the refrigerator and the March wind against the kitchen window. A few days after that, a card arrived in the mail. Fort Wayne postmark. Inside, a note in handwriting I recognized immediately. 44 reasons to say thank you, Otto. I put it on the refrigerator, next to the photo of Agnes in 2001, standing in front of the first truck we ever owned outright. Here is what I've had time to think about since all of this happened. I didn't set out to humiliate my son-in-law. I set out to protect 44 people who couldn't protect themselves in that room. The fact that the truth also happened to answer 3 years of dinner table condescension. That wasn't my design. That was just how the math worked out. Fletcher is still employed at Meridian. His plan wasn't entirely wrong. The company does need to modernize, and he understands the numbers. He's not a bad man. He's a man who mistook intelligence for wisdom and a degree for authority. Those are correctable errors if a person is willing to be corrected. I've been attending quarterly board meetings ever since, in my capacity as retained interest holder, not as a family guest. Fletcher sends his operational updates in advance now. They're thorough. I don't know what happens between him and Rachel. That's not mine to decide. What I know is this. I built that company with my hands, my credit, and 24 years of early mornings. I never needed anyone to acknowledge that. But 44 families in Fort Wayne deserve to know that someone who understood what their work actually cost was still paying attention. He never thought much of me, but he cashed every payroll I authorized. That's the thing about quiet work. It doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be real.